Imagine a man so scary that even other mob bosses whispered his name very carefully. A gangster who wanted so much that he believed not even the group of top bosses could stop him. Carmine the Cigar. Galante was not your usual mafia boss. He was like a storm in a person's body. A tough guy with no feelings who came from the poor streets of East Harlem to control one of the most dangerous heroin businesses America had ever seen, with a cigar held tight in his mouth, and a very strong will that made his enemies do what he said. Galante's rule was built on pure violence, fear, and a strong belief that no one could ever hurt him. But in the world of the mob, power is something you have for a while, not something you own forever. And the same force that helped him become powerful would also write the story of his violent end. This is the story of the man who tried to be smarter than the mafia itself and paid the highest price. On July 12, 1979, at 2:45 in the afternoon, the quiet afternoon suddenly turned violent. 3 men with masks ran onto the back porch, their shotguns and machine guns already pointed. The first gunshot hit Galante in the chest, making his chair fall over backward. As he fell, the cigar stayed held tight in his mouth, a final sign of the look he had created for many years. The gunfire was over in less than 30 seconds. When the smoke was gone, Carmine Galante lay still, his dead eyes staring at the Brooklyn sky. The cigar, somehow still perfectly in place in his mouth, kept on smoking. It was a death scene that was so much like a play, so full of meaning that it would become one of the most famous pictures in the history of the mob. This was the end of the meanest and cruelest boss the American Mafia had ever made. But to understand how this happened, and how a poor immigrant's son became so dangerous that his own group ordered him to be killed, we must go back in time to the poor apartment buildings of East Harlem, where a monster was born. Before we start this amazing trip through the secret parts of the mob, I want to know where in the world you are watching from. Put your city and country in the comments below. And what time is it where you are? Are you getting ready for bed with this story, or starting your day with some true crime? If you are new here, welcome to the family. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep looks into history's most interesting criminals. And if this story keeps you interested, show some love with a like. It really helps us bring you more amazing stories like this. The Lower East Side of Manhattan in the early 1900s was a place full of poor people, sadness, and broken dreams. Into this world of crowded apartment buildings and broken promises, Carmine Galante was born on a cold winter morning in February 1910. His parents, Vincenzo and Vincenza Galante, were part of the big group of immigrants from Sicily who had run away from the terrible poverty of their home country, only to find a different kind of hard life in America. The Galante family was squeezed into a 2-room apartment on East 107th Street, sharing the home with another family and a group of newly arrived relatives that was always changing. The building itself was a picture of a run-down city. It had crumbling bricks, broken windows fixed with cardboard, and a strong smell of cooking cabbage, and people's sadness that seemed to come out of the walls themselves. Vincenzo Galante worked whatever jobs he could find, building things when his back was strong enough, loading ships when there was no factory work, and sometimes no job at all when times were tough for immigrants who could barely speak English. Vincenza took in laundry and sewing to add to their small amount of money. Her fingers were always stained and scarred from years of strong soap and pokes from needles. Carmine's first memories were of being hungry, not the big kind of starvation that you see in the news, but the constant empty feeling that made him dream about food and fight other children for leftover scraps. He learned early that the world was made of people who took things and people who had things taken from. Them? He decided he would never be in the second. Group. By age 8, Carmine was spending more time on the streets than in the crowded apartment. East Harlem was a dangerous teacher, but it was a good one. The neighborhood was controlled by different Italian gangs who had set up their own system of power that was separate from, and often against, the real police. The young boy watched and learned how money was paid for protection, how fights were ended with brass knuckles instead of in courts, and how respect was earned not by what you did, but by how much people feared you. He saw weak men get picked on and strong men do well. The lesson was very clear. Power came from violence, and violence came from being willing to go further than the person you were fighting. Carmine's first serious act of violence happened when he was 10 years old. A neighborhood bully, who was bigger and older, had been scaring younger children all the time, taking their lunch money and beating up anyone who fought back. When the boy went after Carmine's younger sister, something cold and smart clicked on in the future boss's mind. Instead of facing the bully right away, a fight he would surely lose, Carmine waited. He studied the older boy's habits, learned what he did every day, and found his weak spots. One evening, as the bully walked through a small alley as a shortcut, Carmine was waiting with a piece of pipe he had stolen from a construction site. The attack was fast and mean. Carmine hit the bully across the knee, breaking the joint and making him fall to the ground. As the older boy rolled around in pain, screaming for help, Carmine calmly gave him a message. "You touch my sister again, I'll kill you." He walked away, leaving the pipe next to his victim. This event gave young Galante a reputation on the street. He was not just tough, he was smart, patient, and completely cruel when someone bothered him. The news spread through the neighborhood that the Galante boy was not someone to mess with. Going to school did not interest Carmine very much. He went to school sometimes, just enough to stay away from the officers who looked for kids skipping school. But his real learning happened on the streets. By age 12, he was running numbers for local bet takers, delivering messages that couldn't be trusted on the phone, and acting as a lookout for different criminal activities. The work showed him the different levels of the mob in East Harlem. At the bottom were the people who worked on the street, the numbers runners, the collectors for loan sharks, and the small-time thieves who stole to get by. Above them were the crew leaders, men who had shown they were good at violence and leading others. At the top were the bosses, secret men who rarely showed themselves, but their power was felt in every criminal activity in the neighborhood. Carmine studied this system like a smart student. He learned how important it was to be loyal, how necessary it was to be quiet, and the absolute need for respect. He also learned that you moved up by showing you were valuable, either by making money or by getting rid of problems. His first real teacher was a lieutenant for Giuseppe Joe the Boss Miseria. A middle-level soldier named Tommaso Reina. Reina saw something special in the teenager, a mix of smarts and a complete lack of a conscience that showed he would be a future leader. With Reina's help, Carmine began to understand the bigger picture of the mob in New York. The different families were not just random groups of criminals. They were well-organized businesses with their own areas, special skills, and difficult relationships with each other. The key to doing well was not just being tough. It was understanding the politics, making the right friends, and knowing when to fight and when to make a deal. Carmine's first murder happened in 1925, when he was just 15 years old. The person he killed was a man named Antonio Sage, a small-time criminal who had made the mistake of trying to take over a numbers game that was protected by Reina. Sage had been warned twice to stay away, but he had kept trying to take over, probably thinking that his connection to a rival gang would protect him. Reina called Carmine into his social club, a dirty storefront that was the main office for his work. The older man sat behind a scratched wooden desk, looking very serious. "This sage person. He's not listening," Reina said, lighting a thick cigar. "Sometimes people need a stronger message." The job was clear. Without being said out loud, Sage needed to disappear. And Carmine was being given the chance to prove himself. It was both a test and a promotion. If he did it, he would move up in the group. If he failed, he would probably end up dead himself. Carmine spent a week studying the man he was supposed to kill. Sage was a man of habit, going to the same bar every Friday night, always leaving alone around midnight, and always taking the same way home through a few dark side streets. The pattern gave him a chance, and Carmine was not someone who wasted chances. On a rainy Friday night in November, Carmine waited in an alley with a .38 revolver he had stolen from a pawn shop. When Sage showed up, a little drunk and not knowing he was in danger, the teenager stepped out of the shadows. "Hey," Carmine called softly. Sage turned, trying to see in the dim light. "Who's there?" The bullet hit him in the chest, spinning him around and making him fall into a pile of garbage cans. Carmine walked over and fired 2 more times into Sage's head, making sure he would not recover and could not be identified. Then he calmly walked home, stopping only to throw the gun into the East River. The murder was never solved. Sage's body was found the next morning, but there were no people who saw it, no clues, and no clear reason that the police could find. To the police, it was just another unsolved killing in a neighborhood where violence was normal. But in the criminal world, the news spread quickly. The Galante kid had proven himself. He was not just tough. He was a killer. He was someone who could handle the most serious kind of problem solving that the group needed. At 15, Carmine had taken the first step on a path that would one day lead him to control one of the most powerful criminal groups in America. It was around this time that Carmine started the habit that would be his public image for the rest of his life. Cigars were expensive, a fancy item that showed the smoker was successful and smart. For a teenager from the slums, they stood for dreams and success. But for Carmine, cigars were also useful for a more practical reason. The routine of lighting and smoking gave him time to think, to watch, and to show an image of calm control, even in stressful situations. The smoke itself created a small wall between him and others. It was a small but mentally important line that marked his space. He developed specific tastes. He liked Cuban cigars when he could get them, and expensive American tobacco when he could not. He learned to use the cigar as a tool, pointing with it to make his words stronger, using it to time pauses in conversation, and letting the smoke curl around his face to create a mysterious look. The habit quickly became his special mark. Soon, people all over East Harlem knew the cigar when they saw it. He was the young man who was always smoking, always watching, always thinking. The image would stay with him for the next 50 years, becoming so much a part of who he was that even in death he would be remembered with a cigar between his teeth. The Volstead Act, which officially started Prohibition on January 17, 1920, was meant to create a moral and sober America. Instead, it created the biggest criminal opportunity in the nation's history. By the time Carmine Galante was old enough to fully join the mob, the illegal liquor business had changed the American criminal world from small gangs of street criminals into smart business groups. In New York, the 5 families that would later rule the mob were still being formed. The Castellammarese War was starting between Giuseppe Joe the Boss, Masseria, and Salvatore Maranzano. They were 2 Sicilian immigrants who each said they were the rightful leader of Italian-American mobsters. Into this dangerous situation stepped the young Carmine Galante. Now 16, and wanting to add more to his criminal life. The Bonanno family, still known then as the Maranzano family, controlled large parts of Brooklyn and the Bronx. Their leader, Salvatore Maranzano, was an educated man who had studied to be a priest before choosing a different life. He believed in organization, different levels of power, and long-term planning, which were things that Carmine's smart nature liked. Through his teacher Tommaso Reina, who had friends all over the city's criminal world, Carmine was introduced to Maranzano's group. The meeting happened in a restaurant in Little Italy, with Maranzano himself leading what was basically a job interview. "You're young," Maranzano said, studying Carmine across the checkered tablecloth. "But I hear you have potential." The older man was testing him, looking for signs of weakness or too much confidence. Carmine had prepared for this moment, knowing that his future depended on making the right impression. "I'm young enough to learn and old enough to handle business," Carmine replied, lighting one of his signature cigars with steady hands. Maranzano smiled at the answer, that it showed confidence without being arrogant, and ambition without being impatient. These were the qualities he needed in his group as the war's over. Illegal liquor got more intense. Carmine's first job was to help set up a delivery system for Canadian whiskey that was being smuggled across the border. The work required working together with suppliers, drivers, warehouse workers, and stores. It was a difficult delivery challenge that needed both business smarts and the ability to solve problems with violence when needed. The young gangster put all his energy into the work with his usual focus. He learned every part of the operation, from the details of bribing customs officers to the best ways to avoid federal agents. He made friends with dock workers who could hide cases of liquor in normal shipments, with truckers who could move the goods safely across state lines, and with speakeasy owners who were the retail part of the business. But Carmine's real talent was in using force. The illegal liquor business was very competitive, and fights happened all the time over territory, prices, and payment. These fights couldn't be solved in court, so they had to be settled through talks, backed by a real threat of violence. Carmine quickly became known as Maranzano's most effective problem solver. When a rival gang tried to take over their territory, Carmine organized a planned campaign of fear that left 3 men in the hospital and 1 dead. When a speakeasy owner tried to buy liquor from a competing supplier, Carmine paid him a visit that resulted in the man immediately going back to dealing only with the Maranzano organization. His methods were mean but effective. Unlike some gangsters who used big, showy acts of violence, Carmine preferred planned intimidation, that he would study his targets carefully, finding their weaknesses, family members who could be threatened, businesses that could be damaged, or personal habits that could be used against them. One common case involved a Brooklyn speakeasy owner named Mickey Torino who had decided to stop paying protection money to the Maranzano family. Instead of just beating Torino or burning down his place, Carmine used a more clever method. He started by having Torino followed for several weeks, learning that the man was having an affair with a young woman who worked at his place. Then Carmine arranged for Torino's wife to receive anonymous pictures of her husband's affair, along with a note suggesting that her husband's other business problems might be affecting his judgment. When Torino's wife confronted him with the pictures, the speakeasy owner immediately understood the message. The next day, he personally delivered his late protection payments to Carmine, along with a large bonus for past misunderstandings. The growing fight between Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano blew up in 1930, starting a full-scale war that would change New York's criminal world. The Castellammarese War, named after Maranzano's hometown in Sicily, put the old-style Italian-American mobsters against a new generation of leaders who had different ideas about how the business should be run. Carmine, now 20 years old and a trusted member of Maranzano's inner circle, found himself in the middle of one of the most violent times in mob history. War would kill dozens of people over the next year as the two sides fought for control of the very profitable illegal liquor business. The conflict gave Carmine chances to show his value to the group in the most dramatic way possible. As bodies piled up on both sides, Maranzano needed soldiers who could handle the pressure and get results. Carmine proved to be exactly what was needed. His first big job was to get rid of Gaetano Reina, the leader of what would later become the Lucchese family. Reina had been friends with Maranzano, but was suspected of secretly talking with Masseria. The betrayal, if true, could change the outcome of the war. The hit was carefully planned. Reina always stopped at a small grocery store in the Bronx every Tuesday evening to collect protection money from the owner. Carmine set himself up in an apartment across the street, armed with a rifle and a clear view of the store's entrance. On February 26, 1930, as Reina came out of the grocery store counting cash, Carmine's bullet hit him in the head, killing him instantly. The murder sent shockwaves through both groups and showed that no one, no matter their rank, was safe in the growing conflict. The killing made Carmine's reputation as one of the most dangerous men in New York's criminal world. He was not just a street thug anymore. He was a precise tool of death, able to get rid of important targets in the most difficult situations. The Castellammarese War ended suddenly on April 15, 1931, when Joe the Boss Masseria was murdered in a Coney Island restaurant. The killing had been arranged by his own lieutenant, Lucky Luciano, working with Maranzano. But Maranzano's victory did not last long. He was murdered just 5 months later, on September 10, 1931, in a power move planned by Luciano and other younger leaders. After these killings, the modern American Mafia system was created. Lucky Luciano got rid of the position of boss of all bosses that both Masseria and Maranzano had claimed. Instead, he created a system of 5 equal families that would share power in New York. The Bonanno family, now led by a young Sicilian immigrant named Joseph Bonanno, became one of the most powerful groups in this new system. For Carmine Galante, the end of the Castellammarese War was a very important change. At 21, he had proven himself as both a killer and an organizer. His reputation for being cruel and effective had spread throughout the criminal world, and his loyalty to the Bonanno family was total. He was in a position to gain a lot from the new opportunities that would come as Prohibition continued, and the families strengthened their power. Joseph Bonanno saw Carmine's potential and began to prepare him for bigger jobs. The young man was given control of several profitable businesses, including a numbers game in Brooklyn and a loan sharking business that loaned money to small businessmen who couldn't get real credit. But it was Carmine's role in the liquor business that truly set his position in the family. As the illegal liquor business became more organized and profitable, he developed a large network of suppliers, distributors, and stores that made huge amounts of money for the Bonanno organization. His work stretched from the docks of Brooklyn, where ships arrived with Canadian whiskey and Caribbean rum, to the speakeasies of Manhattan, where rich customers paid high prices for good quality alcohol. Carmine watched over every part of the business, from bribing customs officers to collecting debts from customers who paid slowly. In 1932, at age 22, Carmine married Helen Marulli, the daughter of a Brooklyn grocer who had connections to the criminal world but kept his business looking legal. The marriage was both a personal step and a smart partnership, connecting Carmine to a network of businessmen who could provide services and cover for his criminal activities. Helen was a beautiful young woman who understood the world she was marrying into. She had grown up in a neighborhood where the mob was a part of life, and she had real ideas about what marriage to a rising gangster would be like. Still, she was not ready for the huge opposites in Carmine's personality. At home, he could be charming and thoughtful, bringing flowers for no reason, playing with their children when they came, and keeping up the look of a loving family man. He went to church regularly, gave a lot of money to local charities, and was known in the neighborhood as a successful businessman who had managed to rise above his poor beginnings. But this peaceful home life existed next to an ability for violence that was truly amazing. The same hands that gently held his newborn son had killed at least a dozen men. The same mind that planned birthday parties and family vacations also came up, with detailed plans for getting rid of enemies and taking over criminal territory. Helen learned to live with these opposites, developing a choice to not see her husband's real activities. When he came home late with blood on his clothes, she asked no questions. When strangers called at strange hours, speaking in code, she pretended not to hear. When newspaper articles mentioned his name in connection with different crimes, she said they were lies spread by jealous competitors. This ability to separate parts of her life would help her well in the years to come. As Carmine's criminal activities became more and more violent and his enemies grew, she created a bubble of normal life around their family that allowed their children to grow up with some feeling of stability, even as their father built one of the cruelest criminal businesses in American history. Prohibition officially ended on December 5, 1933, when the 21st Amendment was passed. The end of the noble experiment got rid of the single most profitable criminal business in American history, forcing mob families to change or disappear. Many smaller gangs that had relied completely on illegal liquor simply broke up, but the major families, including the Bonannos, had used the Prohibition years to build smart organizations with many different ways of making money. They moved smoothly into other areas, like gambling, loan sharking, taking over labor unions, and most importantly for Carmine's future, selling drugs. By the end of 1933, Carmine Galante had made himself one of the most important people in the Bonanno family. At 23, he controlled many criminal businesses, had proven himself in the most violent fights, and had earned the complete trust of Joseph Bonanno himself. The lessons learned during Prohibition, the importance of organization, the need for violence, the value of corrupting politicians, and the huge profits available to those willing to break the law would guide his actions. For the next 40 years, the stage was set for the next part of his criminal career as he began to build what would become one of the largest and most brutal drug-selling operations in American history. But first, he had to survive the changing world of the mob after Prohibition. New opportunities meant new enemies, and new enemies meant new threats to get rid of. For Carmine Galante, the violence was just beginning. The end of Prohibition created a space in the mob that ambitious men like Carmine Galante were eager to fill, while some families focused on growing their gambling and loan sharking businesses. Carmine saw a different opportunity, one that would turn out to be far more profitable and dangerous than illegal liquor had ever been, selling drugs in the 1930s was still a fairly small business in America. Opium dens were for a small group of customers, mostly Chinese immigrants and artistic people. Cocaine was mainly used as a medicine, but heroin, which comes from morphine and is much more addictive, was starting to appear in major American cities. The drug appealed to Carmine's business sense. Unlike liquor, which needed large production and delivery networks, heroin was small, easy to move, and made huge profits. 1 kilogram of pure heroin, when properly mixed and sold, could make more profit than a truckload of whiskey. More importantly, heroin created its own market. Unlike alcohol, which people could choose to drink or not, heroin addiction was a medical problem that guaranteed customers would come back. Once someone became dependent on the drug, they would do almost anything to get it, creating a steady and growing customer base. Joseph Bonanno was at first not wanting to get into the drug business. The family's older members believed that selling drugs would bring too much attention from the police and could possibly ruin the group's relationship with legal businesses and politicians. But Carmine was convincing. He argued that families who failed to change with the new markets would be left behind by those who were more willing to take risks. He pointed to the huge profits being made by the few groups that were already involved in selling drugs. Most importantly, he offered to personally run the business, keeping the rest of the family away from direct involvement. In 1934, at age 24, Carmine Galante became the Bonanno family's main man for selling drugs. It was a decision that would shape the rest of his life and, in the end, led to his death. Selling heroin required connections in other countries. It went far beyond the North American networks used for illegal liquor. The raw opium came from Turkey and Afghanistan and was turned into a morphine base in Middle Eastern labs, then made into heroin in places all over Southern Europe. Getting the final product to American customers required a complex network of suppliers, refiners, smugglers, and sellers. Carmine's first big success came through his connections to the Sicilian Mafia. Unlike their American cousins, the Sicilian families had kept large relationships all over the Mediterranean. Built over centuries of smuggling and political corruption. These relationships gave access to Turkish opium suppliers and French labs that could turn raw materials into finished heroin. In 1935, Carmine made his first trip to Sicily to set up these connections himself. The trip was both a return to his roots and a business trip, letting him meet family members he had never seen. While building the start of what would become known as the French Connection, the trip was an eye-opener. The American mob, even with its violence and smarts, was still quite simple compared to its Sicilian version. The island's families had been working for generations, creating traditions and methods that had been improved through centuries of fighting and working together. Carmine spent 3 months in Sicily, traveling from Palermo to smaller towns in the countryside, meeting with family leaders and making relationships that would help him for many years. He learned about growing techniques, processing methods, and smuggling routes that had been used for generations to move illegal goods across international borders. More importantly, he learned about the cultural and business ways that made the Sicilian Mafia so effective. The idea of omerta, the code of silence that banned working with the police, was more deeply set than anything that existed in America. The mixing with legal businesses was more complete, the corruption of government officials more planned, and the commitment to violence more total. When Carmine returned to New York in late 1935, he brought back not just business connections, but a new understanding of how the mob could work. He had seen the future, and it involved international networks, huge profits, and a level of smarts that American families were just starting to develop. The processing labs in Marseille, France, became the key link in Carmine's growing heroin empire. The French port city had several things that made it perfect for processing drugs. A large population of Corsican criminals who were willing to work with the Sicilian Mafia, chemical companies that could provide the needed ingredients, and a busy legal shipping industry that could hide illegal cargo. Working with his Corsican friends, Carmine made relationships with lab operators who could turn Turkish morphine base into pure heroin. The labs were smart operations that hired chemists who had learned their skills in real drug companies and who could produce heroin that was much stronger than anything seen before in America. The smuggling operation itself was a masterpiece of organization and corruption. Heroin was hidden in legal cargo furniture machines, food products that was loaded onto ships headed for New York. Corrupt dock workers, customs officers, and shipping company employees made sure that the right containers were never checked too closely. Once the heroin arrived in New York, Carmine's group took over. The pure drug was mixed with lactose, quinine, and other things to increase its amount and profits. The mixed product was then given out through a network of dealers who sold to users in Harlem, Brooklyn, and other neighborhoods where addiction was starting to grow. The profits were huge. A kilogram of pure heroin that cost $5,000 in Marseille could be mixed to produce 10 kilograms of street-level product worth $200,000. In New York, even after paying for transportation, bribes, and the different levels of sellers, the profits were bigger than anything the mob had ever seen. By the late 1930s, Carmine's operation was bringing in hundreds of kilograms of heroin every year, making millions of dollars in profits. For the Bonanno family, the success set his position within the group and gave him the resources he would need for the violent growth that would define the next part of his career. Success in the drug business always brought competition, and competition had to be eliminated. Unlike the illegal liquor wars of Prohibition, which were often fought over territory and political power, the heroin wars were battles for control of supply lines and seller networks. They were more personal, more brutal, and more final. Carmine's first major fight came with the Genovese family, which had started its own heroin importing business through connections in Naples. The two groups found themselves bidding against each other for Turkish opium supplies, which raised costs and lowered profits for everyone involved. Instead of agreeing to share the market, Carmine chose to get rid of the competition completely. The plan started with the murder of 3 Genovese associates who were in charge of keeping relationships with suppliers. The killings were carefully planned to look like the result of fights within their own group, not attacks from outside. The violence quickly got worse. The Genovese family fought back by killing 2 of Carmine's sellers and trying to kill one of his lab operators in Marseille. Carmine responded by bombing a warehouse in Brooklyn where the Genovese organization stored legal goods, causing hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage. The war might have gone on forever, but the other families stepped in. The violence was bringing too much attention from the police, and the constant problems were affecting everyone's business. A sit-down was arranged with people from the Commission, the ruling group of New York's 5 families, acting as peacemakers. The solution was heavily in favor of Carmine's group. The Genovese family agreed to stop competing directly with the Bonanno operation in exchange for being able to buy heroin at wholesale prices. It was a deal that accepted Carmine's power in the business while stopping more killing. The victory made Carmine the main heroin importer for all of New York's mob families. His group became the wholesale supplier for smaller sellers all over the Northeast, making profits that were much bigger than anything the families had seen during Prohibition. Success in the drug trade changed Carmine in basic ways. The huge profits let him live like a king, but the constant violence needed to keep his position hardened him into something like a person with no conscience. The opposites in his personality became more extreme as the importance of his criminal activities grew. At home, he kept up the appearance of a successful businessman and loving family man. He moved his growing family to a large house in Brooklyn. With a swimming pool and large gardens. His children went to private schools and had everything they wanted. Helen was able to live like the wife of a real millionaire, shopping at expensive stores and spending time with other rich women who chose not to ask too many questions about their husband's sources of money. But the violence of his work life began to enter his personal world more often. Death threats arrived at his home. Armed bodyguards became a permanent part of his family's life. Windows were made bulletproof, and cars were armored. The children learned not to answer the door or telephone, and Helen created a detailed system of signals and secret words for talking with her husband's friends. Carmine's own relationship with violence changed from something he had to do to something he became obsessed with. He began to enjoy the planning and carrying out of killings, taking pride in creating more and more detailed ways to get rid of enemies. His special style became the planned, step-by-step murder that served as both a removal and a warning to possible enemies. One particularly brutal example happened in 1940, when a rival drug dealer named Vincent Cole tried to start an independent heroin importing business. Instead of just having Cole killed, Carmine arranged for him to be kidnapped and tortured for several days before being murdered. Body was found in the trunk of a car with signs of long torture and multiple gunshot wounds. The murder did what it was meant to do. No one else tried to challenge Carmine's power in the heroin business for several years. But it also showed how far he had come from his start as a young tough trying to survive on the streets of East Harlem. He was now a man who could order and enjoy the planned torture of another human being for purely business reasons. The start of World War II created new opportunities and challenges for Carmine's organization. On one hand, the war messed up normal smuggling routes and made travel between countries more difficult. Turkish opium supplies became harder to get, and shipping was more heavily watched by military police. The war also created new markets and opportunities. Military men on leave in major cities became customers for heroin and other drugs. Defense workers earning higher pay than ever before had money to spend on illegal fun. Most importantly, the focus of police shifted from crime at home to national security, which put less pressure on established criminal groups. Carmine changed his operations for wartime with his usual effectiveness. He developed new smuggling routes through neutral countries like Spain and Portugal, making relationships with fascist officials who were willing to help in exchange for gold and hard cash. He also began looking at possibilities in South America, where German influence had created opportunities for criminal businesses willing to work with friends of the Axis powers. Most important wartime development was Carmine's growing relationship with Lucky Luciano, who was in prison but still had a lot of power in the mob. Luciano was talking with U.S. Navy intelligence to give information about security on the waterfront in exchange for better treatment in prison and a possible shortening of his sentence. Through other people, Carmine became part of these talks, giving information about foreign contacts and smuggling routes that might be useful for military intelligence. The cooperation created relationships with government officials that would be valuable for decades, creating a network of corruption that went deep into federal police agencies. End of World War II in 1945 marked the beginning of the most profitable time in Carmine Galante's criminal career. The return of millions of Inzier servicemen created a huge market for illegal drugs, gambling, and other bad habits. The economic boom that followed the war put money in people's pockets and created a culture of buying that included illegal drugs. More importantly, the wartime disruption of traditional criminal networks had gotten rid of many of Carmine's competitors. Families that had not been able to adapt to wartime conditions found themselves weakened or destroyed, creating opportunities for groups like the Bonannos that had successfully handled the challenges of the 1940s. Carmine moved quickly to take advantage of these opportunities. He expanded his heroin importing business, setting up new labs in Sicily and mainland Italy, where American dollars could buy the help of officials struggling to rebuild their war-torn economies. He also began exploring markets outside of New York, setting up selling networks in Philadelphia, Boston, and other East Coast cities, where the demand for heroin was growing quickly. The stage was set for the most violent period in American mob history. At its center would be a man who had traveled from the poor apartments of East Harlem to become the most feared criminal in America. A man whose signature cigar had become a symbol of power, violence, and final destruction. The end came suddenly, as these things often do. On February 8, 1962, federal agents arrested Carmine Galante at his Brooklyn home for breaking federal drug laws. The charges were the result of a 3-year investigation that had gotten deeper into his group than any police effort before. Arrest was carefully planned for the young. Biggest effect, FBI agents surrounded the house before sunrise, with extra teams covering possible escape routes. When they knocked on the door, they found Carmine in his silk pajamas, calmly smoking one of his signature cigars and reading the morning newspaper. "Gentlemen," he said to the agents, "I've been expecting you." The charges were shocking in how much they covered and how detailed they were. Federal lawyers charged Carmine with a plan to import and sell heroin, claiming that his group had been responsible for smuggling hundreds of kilograms of the drug into the United States over the last 10 years. The charges could lead to a sentence of 20 years in federal prison. More damaging than the specific charges was the evidence the government had gathered: wiretaps, surveillance pictures, financial records, and stories from witnesses who were cooperating painted a detailed picture of Carmine's criminal empire. For the first time, the full size of his operations was shown to the public. The trial began in September 1962 and became a huge story in the news. Carmine sat in the defendant's chair, dressed perfectly and seemingly not worried, smoking his cigars during breaks and talking quietly with his expensive legal team. The difference between his calm attitude and the horrible crimes described by the lawyers fascinated the press and the public. The evidence against him was too much to ignore. Government witnesses described the murders, torture, and planned violence that had marked his rise to power. Financial experts traced millions of dollars from heroin sales to complex money laundering plans. Most damaging of all, several former friends had agreed to testify against him in exchange for shorter sentences. The defense plan was to question the truthfulness of government witnesses and argue that Carmine was being picked on because he was Italian, rather than being charged for actual crimes. His lawyers painted him as a successful businessman who had been unfairly targeted by police agencies looking for people to blame. But the jury was not convinced. On December 12, 1962, after only 6 hours of discussion, they returned guilty verdicts on all charges. Carmine showed no emotion as the verdict was read, continuing to smoke his cigar and stare straight ahead. At sentencing, the federal judge made his opinion of the defendant clear. "Mr. Galante, you have been responsible for more death and suffering than any criminal who has appeared before this court. Your organization has poisoned our communities and corrupted our institutions. The only right sentence is the maximum allowed by law. Carmine Galante was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison at age 52. He faced the possibility that he might never be a free man again. Carmine began serving his sentence at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, one of the most secure places in the federal prison system. The prison held many of the most dangerous criminals in America, including other mob figures, bank robbers, and violent criminals of every kind. For most prisoners, arriving at Atlanta meant the start of a long process of institutional control meant to break their spirit and force them to follow prison rules. But Carmine was not like most prisoners. Within weeks of his arrival, he had made himself one of the most powerful inmates in the place. The process began with violence. Several prisoners, either trying to build their reputations or acting for rival criminal groups, tried to attack the new arrival. These attempts ended badly for the attackers. Carmine had stayed in good physical shape through decades of criminal activity, and his willingness to use extreme violence had not lessened with being in prison. The first serious fight came when a member of the Genovese family, apparently acting on orders from outside, tried to stab Carmine. In the prison dining hall, the attack was poorly planned and carried out. Carmine not only survived, but managed to take the weapon from his attacker and beat him to death with it before guards could step in. The event established Carmine's reputation among both prisoners and staff. The news spread quickly that the new inmate was not someone to mess with, no matter his age or situation. More importantly, it showed that his group on the outside was still powerful enough to protect him and get back at his enemies. Being in prison did not end Carmine's leadership of his criminal empire. It just changed the ways he used his control. Through a network of visitors, corrupt guards, and coded messages, he continued to manage his groups, operations, and plan for his eventual release. Heroin importing network he had spent decades building continued to work. Under the leadership of trusted lieutenants, the French connection stayed active, with new shipments arriving regularly and being sold through the established network of dealers and sellers. Profits continued to come in, with Carmine's share being carefully invested and protected for his return. But keeping control from prison required new levels of smarts and paranoia. Communications had to be done through codes that could not be figured out by prison officials. Orders had to be given through go-betweens who could be trusted not to give away their source. Most challenging of all, discipline had to be kept among people working for him who were not being directly supervised. Carmine's solution was to create a system of shared responsibility among his lieutenants. Each member of his inner circle was responsible not just for his own actions, but for the loyalty and effectiveness of the others. Created strong reasons for cooperation and watching each other that helped keep the group in line even when he was away. The system was enforced through carefully planned violence. When a lieutenant in Brooklyn began stealing profits from drug sales, he was found dead in his car with signs that he had been tortured before being killed. When a seller in the Bronx began working with federal investigators, his entire family disappeared, never to be seen again. These murders served two purposes. They got rid of specific threats to the group and sent clear messages to anyone else who might be thinking of betrayal or theft. The fact that Carmine could order such killings from federal prison only made his reputation for power and cruelty stronger. Life in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary was run by complex racial and group politics that required careful handling. The prison population was divided into different groups: Italian-American mob figures, African-American gangs from major cities, Mexican cartels, and various white supremacist groups, each with their own territories and interests. Carmine quickly made himself the leader of the Italian-American prisoners, using his reputation and connections to build a powerful group. He formed alliances with leaders of other ethnic groups when it helped him, while staying ready to use violence when talking. Failed. The most important alliance was with a group of Cuban exiles, who had been jailed for their part in various anti-Castro activities. These men had military training and international connections that added to Carmine's own network. In exchange for protection and money, they provided information about police activities and access to weapons and other illegal items. Prison officials found themselves dealing with an inmate who was unlike anyone they had met. Carmine was polite and respectful when talking with staff, never causing discipline problems or breaking the small rules that most prisoners did. But his influence over other inmates was amazing, and his ability to run criminal operations from prison was something never seen before. Several attempts were made to keep him away from the general population, but these efforts did not work. Being isolated only made him seem more mysterious to other prisoners and made him more dependent on outside contacts for talking with his group. Prison officials eventually decided that careful watching was more effective than trying to isolate him. Carmine's time in prison happened at the same time as big changes in international drug selling. The French connection was beginning to face pressure from both American and French police agencies. At the same time, new opportunities were appearing in other parts of the world, especially in Southeast Asia, where the Vietnam War was creating chaos that criminal groups could use. Through his network of friends, Carmine began developing relationships with drug sellers in the Golden Triangle region of Southeast Asia, the area where the borders of Thailand, Laos, and Burma met. Had become a major center for growing opium and producing heroin. The ongoing war in the region made official oversight difficult and corruption relatively easy to arrange. These new connections required a different way of doing things than the European networks Carmine had developed. Over the previous decades, Asian criminal groups operated with different cultural rules and business ways. Building trust and setting up working relationships required patience, understanding of their culture, and large upfront investments. Carmine's representatives spent months in the region, meeting with various groups and learning about local conditions. They discovered that the Golden Triangle offered several advantages over European sources: higher quality opium, lower processing costs, and transportation routes that were less heavily watched by police. By 1965, Carmine's group was importing heroin from both European and Asian sources, creating different supply lines and reducing dependence on any single region. The strategy turned out to be very successful, allowing operations to continue even when police pressure disrupted traditional smuggling routes. While Carmine adapted to prison life, his family struggled with the reality of his being in prison. Helen found herself basically being a single parent to their children while dealing with the social shame of being married to a convicted drug seller. The money he had saved allowed the family to keep their lifestyle, but money could not make up for his absence or protect them from unwanted attention. The children, now teenagers, had to deal with classmates and teachers who knew who their father was. Newspaper articles about his criminal activities were constant, reminders of their complicated family history. Some accepted their father's reputation, seeing it as a source of power and respect. Others were embarrassed and angry, wishing for a normal family life. Helen's response was to create an even stricter separation between their family life and Carmine's criminal activities. She moved the family to a new house in a different neighborhood, hoping to escape some of the fame she encouraged. The children to think of their father as a businessman who had been unfairly prosecuted by government agencies that didn't understand Italian-American culture. This plan worked better for some family members than others. The younger children, who had fewer memories of their father's violent activities, found it easier to accept the cleaned-up version of his life, but the older ones had seen too much to completely believe in the story their mother was creating. The family's relationship with Carmine himself became more and more complex. Prison visits were emotionally tense events where everyone pretended that everything was normal while carefully avoiding any talk of the reality that had brought them to this situation. Carmine played the role of the loving father and husband, asking about school activities and family events, while never admitting to the violence and crime that defined his real life. As his sentence went on, Carmine began planning for his eventual release. The world of the mob had changed a lot during his time in prison, and he would need to change his operations to fit new realities. Federal police had become more advanced and aggressive. Rival criminal groups had moved into territories he had previously controlled. Most importantly, the drug business itself was changing, with new drugs and selling methods creating both opportunities and challenges. His planning was typically thorough and long-term. Money was moved to secure offshore accounts that could fund his return. Relationships were kept with suppliers and sellers who would be key for rebuilding his network. Most importantly, potential rivals were identified and targeted to be gotten rid of before they could interfere with his comeback. The planning showed both Carmine's strengths and his basic weakness, his ability to organize, plan, and carry out complex criminal businesses was still amazing. His willingness to use violence to solve problems was unchanged. His international connections and money were still large, but his 12 years in prison had also kept him away from important changes in American society and criminal culture. The civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and the counterculture revolution had changed American society in ways that would affect the mob. New police techniques, especially in the area of electronic spying, had made traditional criminal methods more likely to be discovered and prosecuted. Perhaps most importantly, Carmine's reputation for extreme violence, which had been a good thing in the world of the 1950s, was becoming a problem in the more advanced criminal world of the 1970s. Other families were beginning to see him as a relic of an earlier, more basic time, a man whose methods might bring unwanted attention to everyone's activities. These changes would become clear only after his release, but the seeds of his eventual downfall were already being planted during his final years in prison. As the world moved on, while he remained frozen in time, planning a comeback based on methods and ideas that were quickly becoming old-fashioned. On December 21st, 1974, after serving 12 years of his 20-year sentence, Carmine Galante walked out of federal prison a free man. His early release was the result of good behavior in crowded prisons, but to those who knew him, it seemed impossible that the most violent boss in mafia history had suddenly become a perfect prisoner. The truth was more complicated. Carmine had indeed been a model prisoner in the technical sense. He had avoided discipline problems and joined in prison programs, but he had also spent his 12 years in jail building relationships, gathering information, and planning his return to power with the same careful method he had always brought to his criminal businesses. Man who walked out of prison in 1974 was physically weaker, but mentally sharp. At 64, his hair was white, and his face was deeply wrinkled. But his dark eyes still held the cold intelligence that had made him feared for decades. He moved more slowly than he had in his youth, but people noticed that he still carried himself with the confidence of a man who expected others to listen to his authority. The media attention around his release was intense. Reporters gathered outside the prison gates, hoping to interview the legendary boss about his plans and intentions. Carmine had no intention of giving them a story. He walked past the cameras without a word, got into a waiting car driven by his son, and disappeared into the Brooklyn neighborhood, where he had first learned that violence was the key to survival. The world he returned to was very different from the one he had left. The drug trade had grown hugely in size, and profit. With new drugs like cocaine beginning to challenge heroin's top spot, the mafia families had adapted to increased police pressure by becoming more secret and more careful. Most importantly, a new generation of leaders had appeared who had different ideas about how the mob should operate in modern America. Carmine Galante was about to discover that the most dangerous part of his criminal career was just beginning. The New York that greeted Carmine Galante when he was released from federal prison looked very little like the city he had left 12 years earlier. The big social changes of the 1960s and early 1970s had changed not just American society, but the very way the mob worked. The drug trade, which had been Carmine's specialty, had grown beyond anything he knew. Heroin addiction had spread from small city areas to become a national problem, affecting every social class and part of the country. But heroin was no longer the only drug in town. Cocaine was starting to become the drug of choice for rich Americans, bringing new players into the drug business and creating unheard of chances for profit. More troubling for Carmine's goals was the change in the mafia families themselves, the increased police pressure after the Appalachian meeting and his own famous trial had forced the groups to become more secret, more separated, and more cautious. The days when bosses could operate openly, meeting regularly and doing business through direct personal contact, were ending. The Commission, the ruling group of New York's 5 families, had turned into a more formal and structured organization. During Carmine's absence, decisions that had once been made through personal relationships and individual action now needed agreement and careful planning. The free-spirited, entrepreneurial way that had marked the mob during the 1940s and 1950s was being replaced by a more corporate model that valued stability over growth and caution over aggression. For a man like Carmine, whose entire career had been built on personal power and individual action, these changes were both a challenge and an opportunity. The increased profits available in the drug trade could fund his return to power, but the new organizational structures would limit his freedom to act. The question was whether he could adapt to the changing world or find himself made old-fashioned by forces he couldn't control. Carmine's first priority after his release was to check what was left of his criminal empire. The heroin importing network he had spent decades building had continued to operate while he was in prison, but 12 years without direct leadership had taken a toll. Some key relationships had ended. Others had been broken up by police actions, and still others had been taken over by rival groups. The French Connection, which had been the main part of his operations for 30 years, was basically gone. A series of arrests and seizures in the late 1960s and early 1970s had destroyed the labs in Marseille and cut the connections between Turkish suppliers and American sellers. The pipeline that had once supplied tons of heroin a year to American addicts had been reduced to a trickle. But Carmine's Smart move in developing other supply sources proved its value. The Asian connections he had built during his time in prison had grown in his absence. With Golden Triangle heroin beginning to take over the American market, his representatives had kept relationships with suppliers and transporters, making sure that his group remained a major player in the business. Despite his physical absence, the home distribution network needed more extensive rebuilding. Many of the street-level dealers who had worked for his group had been arrested, had died, or had moved on to other opportunities. The territories his group had once controlled were now being fought over by rival groups, requiring talks or violence to get them back. Carmine approached this challenge with his usual careful planning. Instead of trying to reclaim everything at once, he focused on key strategic assets, the most profitable territories, the most reliable suppliers, and the most capable associates. His strategy was to rebuild from a position of strength, then expand systematically to reclaim his former dominance. The process required a large financial investment. 12 years of legal costs and reduced income had used up some of his money, though he was still extremely wealthy by any standard. More challenging was the need to re-establish his credibility and the fear he inspired among potential competitors and people working for him. His reputation was still strong, but a reputation had to be backed by proven ability. Carmine's return to active leadership happened at the same time as a major crisis within the Bonanno family itself. Joseph Bonanno, the longtime boss who had been Carmine's supporter and protector, had been forced to retire by pressure from the other families and federal police. The process of choosing a new leader had been disputed and messy, leaving the group weakened and divided. The new leadership, headed by Natalie Evola and later by Philip Rastelli, had a different approach to the mob than the one Carmine had grown up with. These men were more cautious, more willing to compromise with other families, and more concerned with avoiding police attention than with maximizing profits and territory. From Carmine's point of view, this represented weakness and a missed opportunity. His 12 years in prison had only strengthened his belief that aggressive expansion and systematic violence were the keys to success in the mob. He saw the new leadership's cautious approach as a betrayal of the principles that had made the Bonanno family powerful in the first place. The tension between Carmine's vision and the family's new direction came to a head during a meeting in late 1975. The discussion focused on whether to expand drug-selling operations or to limit them because of increased federal enforcement. Carmine argued strongly for expansion, presenting financial numbers that showed the enormous profits available to groups willing to take calculated risks. The family leadership was not convinced. They pointed to the long sentences being given to convicted drug sellers and argued that the potential profits were not worth the risks. Also noted that Carmine's own 12-year imprisonment showed the dangers of high-profile involvement in the drug trade. The meeting ended without a decision, but the lines of conflict were clearly drawn. Carmine left convinced that the family leadership was weak and not thinking long-term. The leadership was left convinced that Carmine was a dangerous problem whose methods would bring unwanted attention to everyone's activities. Frustrated by what he saw as the shyness of the official family leadership, Carmine began building his own independent power base within the Bonanno organization. He used his personal wealth and international connections to create a network of associates who were loyal to him personally rather than to the family's official structure. This network included both longtime friends who had remained loyal during his time in prison and younger members who were attracted by his reputation and the opportunities his operations provided. The combination created a strong group within the group, one that operated according to Carmine's methods and answered to his authority. The independent operation focused mainly on drug selling, the area where Carmine's expertise and connections gave him the greatest advantages. Asian suppliers were producing higher quality heroin than had ever been available in the American market, and his distribution network was more efficient and profitable than anything his competitors could offer. But Carmine's ambitions went beyond drugs. He began moving into other areas of criminal activity, including taking over labor unions, illegal gambling, and loan sharking. His approach was characteristically aggressive. Instead of negotiating territory boundaries with other groups, he simply moved into profitable areas and eliminated anyone who objected. This strategy created enormous profits, but also generated a lot of opposition. Other families found their own operations being disrupted by Carmine's expansion, and they began to see him as a threat to the stability of the entire mob system in New York. The commission received many complaints about his activities, but official punishments were difficult to carry out because he technically remained a member in good standing of this Bonanno family. The mid-1970s saw the rise of cocaine as a major force in American drug markets, and Carmine was among the first to see the opportunities this presented. Unlike heroin, which was associated with street addicts and city decay, cocaine was becoming fashionable among rich professionals who saw it as a sophisticated recreational drug. The market dynamics were completely different from anything Carmine had encountered in the heroin trade. Cocaine users were often wealthy, well-educated people who could afford to pay high prices for quality products. They were also more likely to use drugs socially, creating a word-of-mouth marketing effect that rapidly expanded the customer base. Most importantly, cocaine was not physically addictive in the way that heroin was. Users could continue their use for longer periods without the physical decline that marked heroin addiction, creating a more stable and profitable customer base. The profit margins were extraordinary. Cocaine that cost $5,000 per kilogram in Colombia could be sold for $100,000 or more in New York after being mixed and distributed. Carmine moved aggressively into the cocaine trade, using his international connections to establish relationships with suppliers in South America. The same networks that had been used for heroin smuggling could be adapted for cocaine transportation, and the same distribution systems could handle both products. But the cocaine trade also attracted competition from unexpected sources. Colombian criminal organizations were beginning to establish their own operations in American cities, bypassing traditional Italian-American go-betweens and dealing directly with street-level distributors. These groups brought levels of violence and organizational sophistication that challenged even experienced operators like Carmine. The competition led to a series of violent conflicts as different organizations fought for control of the lucrative cocaine trade. Carmine's response was characteristically brutal. Instead of trying to negotiate territorial divisions, he began systematically eliminating competitors through carefully planned assassinations. Between 1975 and 1978, Carmine's organization was responsible for an estimated 25 murders related to drug trafficking disputes. The killings were carried out with a level of planning and execution that demonstrated both Carmine's organizational capabilities and his complete lack of moral restraint. The victims included rival drug dealers, potential witnesses against his organization, and even members of his own network who were suspected of disloyalty or theft. Each murder was carefully planned to send a specific message to a specific audience, creating a climate of fear that extended far beyond the immediate victims. One particularly brutal example occurred in 1976 when a Colombian cocaine supplier attempted to establish direct relationships with Carmine's street-level distributors. Instead of simply killing the supplier, Carmine arranged for him to be kidnapped and tortured for several days before being murdered. Body was found with evidence of extreme torture and a note warning other potential competitors to stay away from his territory. The systematic violence had its intended effect. Potential competitors learned to avoid direct confrontation with Carmine's organization, and his own associates learned that betrayal would be met with swift and brutal retaliation. But the campaign of murder also attracted increasing attention from law enforcement and created growing concern among other organized crime families. The other families had their own drug trafficking operations, and they were being affected by the law enforcement response to Carmine's activities. Federal agents were conducting more aggressive investigations. Courts were imposing longer sentences, and political pressure was mounting for more effective action against organized crime. From their perspective, Carmine's methods were creating problems for everyone. By 1977, the commission was receiving regular complaints about Carmine's activities from all 5 New York families. His territorial expansion was disrupting established arrangements. His violence was attracting unwanted attention, and his independence from family authority was setting a dangerous example for other ambitious members. The official family leadership found itself in an impossible position. They could not control Carmine because he had built an independent power base and had the resources to resist their authority. But they could not disown him because he remained technically a member of their organization, and his activities generated substantial revenue for the family. Several meetings were held to address the crisis, with representatives from all the families participating. The discussions were heated, with some members arguing for direct action against Carmine while others advised caution. The debate revealed fundamental disagreements about the future direction of organized crime in New York. The older members, who had lived through the violence of earlier decades, understood the dangers of internal warfare. They remembered the Castellammarese War and the disruption it had caused to everyone's operations. They favored negotiation and compromise, even if it meant accepting Carmine's continued independence. But younger members, who had grown up during the more stable period of the 1960s, saw Carmine as a throwback to a more primitive era. They argued that his methods were outdated and dangerous, threatening the sophisticated business arrangements that had allowed organized crime to prosper while avoiding the massive law enforcement crackdowns of earlier decades. Debate ultimately centered on a fundamental question. Was Carmine Galante an asset to organized crime or a threat to its continued existence? His supporters pointed to his enormous profits and his effectiveness at eliminating competition. His critics argued that his violence and independence threatened the stability of the entire system. The Commission's inability to reach a consensus on how to handle the Carmine problem led him to make the most daring move of his criminal career. In early 1978, at age 68, he declared himself the acting boss of the Bonanno family, bypassing the official leadership and claiming direct authority over all family operations. The declaration was made during a meeting at a restaurant in Brooklyn, with representatives from all the major crews within the family in attendance. Carmine arrived flanked by his most trusted associates, his trademark cigar sending smoke curling toward the ceiling as he took his place at the head of the table. "Things have been drifting for too long," he announced to the assembled group. "This family needs leadership that understands opportunities and isn't afraid to take them. Starting today, all operations report through me." The reaction was mixed. Some members particularly those involved in drug trafficking, welcomed the change. They had been frustrated by the official leadership's cautious approach and saw Carmine as someone who could maximize their earning potential. But others were appalled by what they saw as a direct challenge to the established order. Several members walked out of the meeting rather than acknowledge Carmine's authority. Others remained, but made clear their reservations about the direction he was taking the organization. The family was effectively split between those who supported his aggressive approach and those who favored the more traditional methods of the official leadership. The declaration created an immediate crisis that extended far beyond the Bonanno family. Carmine was claiming authority over one of the 5 most important organized crime families in America without the approval of the Commission or even his own organization's official leadership. It was an unprecedented challenge to the system that had governed organized crime for decades. Carmine's declaration of leadership was accompanied by an ambitious expansion of his international operations. No longer limited by family politics or commission oversight, he began implementing plans he had been developing since his release from prison. The centerpiece of his strategy was the creation of what he called the Pizza Connection, a network of pizzerias and Italian restaurants that would serve as fronts for drug money laundering and distribution. Points for heroin and cocaine. The restaurants provided perfect cover because they dealt primarily in cash, had legitimate reasons for frequent deliveries, and could employ associates without raising suspicion. The operation extended from New York to cities across the United States and into Canada, creating a continental network for drug distribution and money laundering. Each restaurant was operated by associates who understood that their primary business was not food service, but facilitating criminal activities. But Carmine's ambitions extended even further. He began exploring opportunities in Europe, where his old connections in Sicily and southern Italy could be revived and expanded. The goal was to create a truly international criminal empire that could operate independently of the traditional family structures and territorial limitations. Expansion required enormous investments of time, money, and personnel. Carmine spent months traveling between cities, meeting with potential partners, and overseeing the establishment of new operations. His organization grew from a regional drug trafficking network to something approaching a multinational corporation with interests spanning multiple countries and continents. The success was extraordinary. By 1978, Carmine's operations were generating an estimated $100 million annually in gross revenues, with profit margins that exceeded those of most legitimate businesses. His personal wealth was estimated at over $500 million, making him one of the richest criminals in American history. The Commission watched Carmine's expansion with growing alarm. His success was undeniable, but so were the risks his methods created for everyone else in organized crime. The massive law enforcement attention his activities attracted threatened to disrupt all 5 families' operations. More troubling was his apparent ambition to expand beyond traditional territorial boundaries. Intelligence reports suggested that he was attempting to establish operations in cities that were controlled by other families, potentially creating conflicts that could spiral into open warfare. The final straw came when federal investigators began connecting Carmine's activities to several unsolved murders in different cities. The deaths appeared to be part of a systematic campaign to eliminate competitors and establish his organization's dominance in new territories. The violence was approaching levels that had not been seen since the gang wars of the 1920s. In late 1978, the Commission made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. despite his status as a maid, member of the Bonanno family, and his enormous contributions to organized crime's profits. Carmine Galante was marked for death. The decision was reached unanimously, with even some members of his own family supporting the action. The reasoning was straightforward. Carmine had become too powerful and too independent to be controlled through traditional methods. His activities were threatening the stability of organized crime throughout the Northeast. Most importantly, his apparent ambition to become a boss of bosses challenged the fundamental power-sharing arrangement that had kept peace between the families for decades. The decision to eliminate Carmine required careful planning and absolute secrecy. He was surrounded by loyal bodyguards, changed his routines to avoid predictable patterns, and had survived numerous assassination attempts throughout his career. Any plan to kill him would have to account for his experience and paranoia. The commission assigned the task to a combined team drawn from multiple families, ensuring that no single organization could be held responsible for the action. The team included some of the most experienced killers in organized crime, men who had proven their ability to handle high-profile targets under difficult circumstances. The planning took months, with team members conducting extensive surveillance to identify Carmine's habits and vulnerabilities. They learned that he frequently ate lunch at Joe and Mary's restaurant in Brooklyn, a small establishment owned by his cousin, Giuseppe Turano. The restaurant provided several advantages. It was in friendly territory where Carmine felt safe. It had multiple exits and entrances that could be controlled, and it was far enough from major streets to minimize the risk of interference by passing police patrols. Surveillance revealed that Carmine typically arrived at the restaurant around 2 p.m. for a late lunch, usually accompanied by 2 or 3 associates. He preferred to sit in the back patio area, where he felt protected from observation and potential attack. The routine was regular, enough to be predictable, but varied enough to avoid easy detection. Most importantly, the team discovered that Carmine's security arrangements, while extensive, had a crucial weakness. His bodyguards were positioned to protect against an attack from outside the restaurant, but not from within. If the killers could gain access to the interior of the building, they could reach him before his security could react. The last weeks of Carmine's life were marked by an increasing sense of isolation and paranoia. Intelligence reports suggested that something was being planned against him, but the sources were unclear and the timing uncertain. He increased his security, changed his routines even more frequently, and began sleeping in different locations each night. But he also seemed to understand that his situation was ultimately not sustainable. At age 69, he had reached the highest point of power in organized crime, but that very success had made him too dangerous for the system to tolerate. In conversations with close associates, he spoke increasingly about death and his legacy, subjects that had rarely interested him during his rise to power. His relationship with his family became more complicated during this period. Helen and his children understood that he was in danger, but they also knew better than to ask direct questions about his activities or situation. Their visits became more frequent, but also more strained, with everyone aware that each meeting might be their last. Carmine's behavior during this period revealed both his strengths and his fundamental limitations as a criminal leader. His organizational abilities and strategic thinking remained sharp, allowing him to continue expanding his operations, even under enormous pressure. But his inability to compromise or adapt to changing circumstances had created a situation where violence was the only possible solution. He seemed to recognize this contradiction, but was unable or unwilling to change his approach. In his final recorded conversation, captured by an FBI wiretap, just days before his death. He told an associate, "I've lived my whole life one way. I'm not going to change now because some people don't like the results." The day began like any other for Carmine Galante. He woke up early in a safe house in Brooklyn, read the morning newspapers while smoking his first cigar of the day, and reviewed reports from his various operations. The profits continued to roll in from drug trafficking, money laundering, and other criminal enterprises. From a business perspective, his organization had never been more successful. Around noon, he received a call from his cousin, Giuseppe Torano, inviting him to lunch at Joe and Mary's restaurant. The invitation was routine. Carmine ate at the restaurant frequently, and family meals were one of the few remaining pleasures in his increasingly dangerous life. He agreed to meet Torano at 2 p.m., bringing along Leonardo Coppola, a trusted associate who often accompanied him to business meetings. The restaurant was quiet when they arrived, with only a few customers remaining from the lunch rush. Carmine chose his usual table on the back patio, positioning himself with his back to the wall where he could observe anyone entering the area. He ordered his favorite meal and lit one of his trademark Cuban cigars. Settling in for what he expected to be a relaxing afternoon with family. The conversation was a routine discussion of family matters, updates on various business operations, and complaints about the changing nature of their neighborhood. Torano mentioned that some of the younger members of the organization were becoming restless, wanting more action and faster advancement. Carmine dismissed these concerns with a wave of his cigar, noting that young men had always been impatient. At 2:45 p.m., 3 men entered the restaurant through the front door. They moved with purpose, but without obvious haste, attracting no particular attention from the staff or customers. All 3 were wearing light jackets despite the summer heat, and all 3 had their faces partially hidden by hats and sunglasses. The men walked directly through the restaurant to the back patio, pulling out their weapons only when they reached the doorway leading to Carmine's table. The first shots were fired before anyone on the patio fully understood what was happening. Carmine was struck in the chest by the first blast from a shotgun, the impact throwing him backward in his chair. As he fell, his hand instinctively moved toward his own weapon, but he was already too badly wounded to defend himself. The second and third shots came in rapid succession, ensuring that there would be no chance of survival or retaliation. The entire attack lasted less than 30 seconds. When the shooting stopped, Carmine Galante lay motionless on the patio floor, his lifeless eyes staring at the afternoon sky. The trademark cigar remained clenched between his teeth, still smoldering in the summer heat. The assassination of Carmine Galante sent shockwaves throughout organized crime, law enforcement, and the media. The dramatic circumstances of his death, killed while eating lunch with his cigar still in his mouth, created a famous image that would define public ideas of mafia violence for decades to come. For law enforcement, the murder was both a victory and a new challenge. The elimination of one of the most dangerous criminals in American history removed a major threat to public safety and could possibly reduce the violence linked to drug trafficking in New York. But it also showed that organized crime was still powerful enough to get rid of problems through planned assassination. Even when those problems were as big as Carmine Galante, the FBI investigation into the murder was intense, but, in the end, unsuccessful. Despite extensive spying on organized crime figures and careful analysis of the crime scene, no arrests were ever made. The killers had planned and carried out the assassination with a level of skill that left few clues for investigators to follow. Within organized crime itself, the murder served its intended purpose. The commission had eliminated a threat to the established order and sent a clear message that no single person, no matter their wealth or reputation, was more powerful than the system itself. The violence and disruption that had marked the late 1970s began to calm down as other ambitious figures learned the limits of acceptable behavior. But the assassination also marked the beginning of a new era in organized crime, one defined by increased federal law enforcement pressure and growing instability within the families themselves. The Pizza Connection investigation, launched in part by information gathered from Carmine's operations, would eventually lead to hundreds of arrests and convictions. The methods he had pioneered for international drug trafficking would be adopted by other criminal organizations, leading to a rise in both profits and violence that continues to this day. The life and death of Carmine Galante represented both the highest point and the ultimate failure of a particular way of doing organized crime. His career showed that extraordinary wealth and power could be achieved through systematic violence and ruthless ambition. But it also showed that such methods ultimately create more enemies than even the most capable criminal can eliminate. The techniques he developed for international drug trafficking became the model for criminal organizations worldwide. The Pizza Connection network he created was copied by other groups looking to launder money and distribute drugs across national borders. His understanding of how corruption could be used to protect criminal operations influenced generations of organized crime figures. But his legacy was also one of destruction and waste. The violence he used to build his empire ultimately consumed him and dozens of others. The communities affected by his drug trafficking operations suffered uncountable damage from addiction and crime. The law enforcement response to his activities led to surveillance and prosecution methods that would eventually weaken organized crime throughout the United States. Perhaps most significantly, his death marked the end of an era in American organized crime. The freewheeling, go-getter approach that had defined the Mafia during the middle decades of the 20th century was giving way to a more corporate, risk-avoiding model that emphasized survival over expansion. Future leaders would study Carmine's career as both an inspiration and a warning. His success showed what was possible for those willing to take extreme risks and use extreme methods. His death showed the ultimate consequences of pushing those methods too far. On that hot July afternoon in 1979, as the smoke from Carmine Galante's final cigar mixed with the gunpowder smell from the assassin's weapons, an era in American organized crime came to a violent end. The man who had risen from the core apartments of East Harlem to become the most feared criminal in the nation lay dead at 69. His lifeless body was a testament to both the power of systematic violence and its ultimate limits. The cigar that remained clenched between his teeth became the defining image of his death, symbolizing the dramatic nature of mafia violence and the almost movie-like quality of his life and career. But beneath the symbolism lay a more complex truth about the nature of power, corruption, and the American dream itself. Carmine Galante's story was, in its own twisted way, a version of the immigrant success story that has defined American myths for generations. He had indeed risen from poverty to wealth, from powerlessness to influence, from being unknown to being nationally recognized. But the methods he used to achieve this transformation corrupted not only himself, but everyone and everything he touched. His drug trafficking operations generated billions of dollars in profits over 4 decades, but they also created immeasurable suffering in the communities where addiction took hold. His systematic violence eliminated dozens of rivals and obstacles, but it also created a culture of fear and brutality that extended far beyond his immediate targets. His corruption of officials and institutions protected his criminal enterprises, but it also weakened the very foundations of democratic government. The investigation into his murder would continue for years without a solution, becoming one of the most famous unsolved cases in organized crime history. But in many ways, the identity of his killers mattered less than the fact that the system he had both used and challenged had finally turned against him. He had become too successful, too independent, and too dangerous for even organized crime to tolerate. The aftermath of his death would see significant changes in how both criminals and law enforcement approached organized crime. The international networks he had built would be adopted and expanded by new generations of criminals, but they would also be targeted by increasingly sophisticated law enforcement techniques. The violence he had normalized would continue, but it would be more carefully controlled and less publicly visible. For his family, his death meant freedom from the constant threat of violence that had defined their lives for decades, but also the loss of the wealth and protection his criminal success had provided. For his associates, it meant the opportunity to build their own organizations without his dominating presence, but also the loss of the expertise and connections that had made their success possible. For law enforcement, his death removed one of their most wanted targets, but also eliminated a source of intelligence about organized crime operations. The FBI had been close to building cases against his entire organization when he was killed, and his death complicated efforts to prosecute his associates and dismantle his network. For the communities affected by his operations, his death offered hope that the violence and corruption he represented might finally be ending. But the drug trafficking networks he had established would continue under new leadership, and the problems his activities had created would persist long after his death. Perhaps most significantly, his death marked the transformation of organized crime from a mostly Italian-American thing to a more diverse and international business. The methods he had pioneered for building criminal networks across national and ethnic lines would be adopted by groups from every part of the world, creating new forms of organized crime that were even more difficult for law enforcement to fight. The cigar-smoking boss who had terrorized New York for half a century was gone, but the systems of violence, corruption, and taking advantage of people that he had perfected would live on. His death was both an ending and a beginning, the end of one criminal career and the foundation for countless others that would follow. In the end, Carmine Galante's life showed the basic contradiction at the heart of the American experience. He had achieved the success that society promised was available to anyone willing to work hard and take risks, but the methods he used to achieve that success ultimately destroyed not only his enemies and rivals, but himself and much of what he had built. The man who had spent his entire adult life proving that violence was the ultimate source of power died violently, killed by men who had learned from his own example that some problems could only be solved through systematic elimination. It was a fitting end for a life defined by brutality, and a reminder that those who live by the gun will eventually die by it. The restaurant where he died would eventually close, unable to escape the fame of that July afternoon. But the legend of the cigar-smoking boss would live on, inspiring fear, fascination, and countless imitators who believed they could succeed where he had ultimately failed. They would be wrong, of course. The world had changed in ways that made his methods outdated and his ambitions impossible. But the dream of unlimited power and wealth through systematic violence would continue to attract new generations of criminals, each believing they could avoid the fate that had happened to their predecessor. The smoke from Carmine Galante's final cigar eventually faded away in the Brooklyn afternoon, but the legacy of his violence and ambition would continue to poison American society for decades to come. He had achieved a kind of immortality, but it was the immortality of a warning tale rather than the heroic legend he might have preferred. In the end, that may be the most fitting memorial for a man who had caused so much suffering while pursuing his own twisted version of the American dream. He had gotten everything he wanted: wealth, power, respect, and recognition. But the price had been his humanity, his family's peace, and ultimately his life. The cigar that remained between his teeth as he died became a symbol not of power or sophistication, but of the ultimate pointlessness of a life spent. Chasing dominance through violence. It was a final statement from a man who had never learned that some victories come at too high a price, and that the methods used to achieve success ultimately decide its meaning and how long it lasts. Carmine, the cigar. Galante was dead, but the America that had produced him, with its opportunities and temptations, its promise of success, and its tolerance for corruption, remained unchanged at the poor apartments of East Harlem, continued to produce young men hungry for power and willing to do anything to achieve it. The only difference was that now they had his example to follow and his fate to avoid. The story of the cigar-smoking boss was over, but the larger story of American organized crime, with all its violence, corruption, and ultimately self-destructive ambition, would continue. New names would replace his in the headlines, new methods would replace his techniques, and new victims would suffer from the consequences of criminal ambition running free. But none would quite match the dramatic brutality and systematic ruthlessness that had made Carmine Galante both the most successful and most hated criminal of his generation. He had been unique in his time, and his death marked the end of an era that would never return. The cigar had finally gone out, and with it, one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history had come to its inevitable, violent end. The story of Carmine Galante serves as a reminder of the real costs of organized crime, not just to its members, but to the communities, families, and institutions affected by their activities. While his life may seem dramatic or even glamorous looking back, it represents a path of violence and corruption that ultimately destroyed everyone it touched, including Galante himself. We tell these stories not to praise criminal behavior, but to understand a dark chapter in American history, and to remember that behind every crime member are real victims whose lives were forever changed by the actions of men like Carmine Galante. Legacy serves as a warning about the ultimate consequences of choosing power over humanity, violence over law, and personal ambition over the good of everyone. The cigar may have been his trademark, but the violence was his true signature, and that signature was ultimately written in blood, including his own dot. In the weeks after Carmine Galante's assassination, the FBI launched one of the most intense investigations in the Bureau's history, Operation Cigar Smoke, as it was internally codenamed, involved over 200 agents across multiple field offices, each given the task of untangling the complex web of relationships and reasons that had led to the murder. The crime scene itself had been meticulously planned and executed. Forensic analysis revealed that the killers had used multiple weapons: shotguns for the initial attack and handguns for the finishing shots. The ammunition was untraceable, purchased from various sources across different states over several months. Even the getaway cars had been stolen weeks before and changed to avoid easy identification. But perhaps most telling was what the investigation revealed about how deep the conspiracy was. Wiretaps installed in the months before Galante's death had captured bits of conversations, suggesting that his elimination had been discussed at the highest levels of organized crime. References to the problem and taking care of business appeared in surveillance recordings from all 5 New York families, showing that his death had been approved by the commission itself. Agent Anthony Rossi, who led the federal task force investigating the murder, would later write in his memoir, "We weren't just investigating a single murder. We were looking at the carrying out of a business decision made by the most sophisticated criminal enterprise in American history. Every lead we followed revealed another layer of planning, another level of organizational complexity that went far beyond anything we had encountered before." The investigation ultimately produced over 50,000 pages of documents, hundreds of hours of surveillance recordings, and testimony from dozens of witnesses. But despite this enormous effort, no one was ever convicted of Carmine Galante's murder. The men who pulled the triggers disappeared into the underworld as effectively as if they had never existed. Ironically, Carmine's death gave law enforcement opportunities that his life had denied them. Disruption of his organization's leadership created chaos in the very networks he had spent decades perfecting. Associates began fighting among themselves for control of profitable territories, security, procedures that had been meticulously maintained. Under his iron discipline began to break down. Most significantly, the Pizza Connection network that had been his masterpiece became vulnerable to being infiltrated. Without his oversight, restaurant operators began taking shortcuts that exposed them to being caught. Money laundering. Procedures became sloppy. Communications that had once been conducted through elaborate codes started becoming more direct and understandable. Breakthrough came in 1980, just a year after Galante's death, when federal agents successfully placed an undercover agent inside one of the key Connection restaurants in Queens. The agent, pretending to be a corrupt businessman looking to launder money, was able to document the full scope of the operation over an 18-month period. The investigation that followed, known as the Pizza Connection case, became the largest prosecution of organized crime figures in American history up to that time. Over 200 defendants were ultimately charged, with convictions secured against more than half of them. The network that Carmine had built to span continents was systematically dismantled, restaurant by restaurant, connection by connection. But the case also revealed the true scope of what Carmine had accomplished. Federal prosecutors estimated that his Pizza Connection had laundered over $2 billion in drug money. During its peak years of operation, the network had extended to over 60 cities across the United States and Canada, with connections to criminal organizations in Sicily, South America, and Southeast Asia. U.S. Attorney Rudolph Giuliani, who prosecuted many of the Pizza Connection defendants, observed that Galante had essentially created the template for international organized crime in the modern era. His death didn't end the threat. It multiplied it, as dozens of smaller organizations tried to copy his methods without his organizational genius. As federal investigators dismantled Carmine's empire, they also began to document the full extent of the human suffering his operations had caused. The Drug Enforcement Administration estimated that heroin distributed through his networks had been responsible for over 10,000 overdose deaths between 1950 and 1979. The actual number was likely much higher, as many deaths were never properly investigated or recorded. The geographic scope of this destruction was staggering. Addiction rates in neighborhoods served by his distribution networks were typically 3 to 4 times higher than in areas controlled by other criminal organizations. Emergency rooms in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Manhattan reported waves of overdoses that lined up directly with the arrival of new shipments through his smuggling routes. Dr. Margaret Chun, who worked in emergency medicine at Bellevue Hospital during the 1970s, remembered the impact vividly. We could always tell when a new batch of Galante's heroin hit the streets. The purity was higher than anything else available, which meant more overdoses. We would see entire families destroyed, parents, children, grandparents, all victims of the same supply chain. The violence associated with his operations was equally extensive. Police departments across the Northeast had linked over 200 murders to territorial disputes involving his organization. These deaths included not just rival criminals and uncooperative witnesses, but innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire of his territorial wars. perhaps most tragically. Many of the victims were young people who had been recruited into his organization as runners, lookouts, and low-level dealers. These teenagers and young adults, drawn by the promise of easy money and respect, often ended up dead or in prison before their 25th birthdays. The neighborhoods where Carmine had operated became virtual war zones, with legitimate businesses fleeing and families living in constant fear of violence. Carmine's death marked more than the end of one criminal career. It represented a fundamental shift in how organized crime operated in America. The publicity surrounding his assassination and the subsequent investigations forced all criminal organizations to become more cautious, more secretive, and more sophisticated in their methods. The old model of the charismatic boss who ruled through personal dominance and visible displays of power became obsolete overnight. Law enforcement had demonstrated that such figures, regardless of their wealth or influence, could be identified, investigated, and eliminated. Future leaders would need to be more subtle, more anonymous, and more careful about attracting attention. This transformation was already visible within months of Galante's death. The new leadership of the Bonanno family implemented strict rules about public behavior, media contact, and showing off wealth. Similar changes occurred throughout organized crime as bosses retreated from public view and gave more authority to lower-level operatives. The drug trade itself evolved in response to the lessons of Carmine's career. Instead of the centralized, top-down networks he had built, new organizations adopted cellular structures that were harder to penetrate and dismantle. Instead of relying on family and ethnic connections, they recruited operatives from diverse backgrounds who were harder for law enforcement to profile and predict. But these adaptations came at a cost. The more sophisticated organized crime became, the less unified and controllable it became. The discipline that had characterized the mafia, families began to break down as authority became more spread out and operations became more compartmentalized. Violence became more random and less strategic, affecting innocent bystanders more frequently. The dramatic circumstances of Carmine's death ensured that his story would become part of American popular culture in ways that went beyond the reality of his criminal activities. The image of the cigar-smoking boss, gunned down while eating lunch, became an iconic representation of mafia violence that influenced countless books, movies, and television shows. Hollywood's interpretation of his story typically emphasized the dramatic and theatrical aspects of his life while minimizing the human cost of his activities. Films and television shows portrayed him as a complex anti-hero, violent but charismatic, ruthless but loyal to his family. This romanticized version had little resemblance to the reality of a man whose career was built on systematic murder and drug trafficking. The myth-making process began almost immediately after his death. Newspaper articles described him as the last of the old-school bosses and a man who lived by his own code. Magazine profiles emphasized his rise from poverty to power while glossing over the methods he had used to achieve that transformation. This romanticization had real consequences. Young men in neighborhoods, similar to the one where Carmine had grown up, began to see him as a role model rather than a cautionary tale. The violence and criminality that had defined his life became something to aspire to rather than something to be repulsed by. Drug dealing and illegal gambling were reframed as entrepreneurial activities rather than destructive criminal enterprises. Law enforcement officials struggled to counter this narrative. FBI Director William Webster noted in congressional testimony, "The media's portrayal of figures like Galante creates a dangerous mythology that obscures the reality of organized crime. These were not romantic figures fighting against an oppressive system. They were predators who destroyed communities for personal profit." Perhaps Carmine's most lasting impact was his role in globalizing organized crime. The international networks he had built to facilitate drug trafficking became the template for criminal organizations worldwide. His methods for corruption, money laundering, and violence were studied and copied by groups from Colombia to Sicily to Southeast Asia. The Sicilian Mafia, in particular, expanded their operations using techniques that Carmine had pioneered. The same routes he had used to smuggle heroin became pathways for human trafficking, arms dealing, and other forms of international crime. The pizza connection model was adapted for different types of businesses in different countries, creating a global network of criminal enterprises that continues to operate today. Colombian drug cartels studied his organizational methods and applied them to cocaine trafficking on an even larger scale. The Medellin and Cali cartels of the 1980s used modified versions of his cellular structure and corruption techniques to build empires that were even bigger than his accomplishments. Pablo Escobar himself reportedly kept copies of FBI reports about Carmine's operations as reference materials for his own criminal enterprise. But the international expansion of organized crime also created new vulnerabilities. As criminal networks became more global, they also became more dependent on international cooperation and more vulnerable to disruption by coordinated law enforcement efforts. The very success of Carmine's model ultimately led to the development of international task forces and treaties designed to combat transnational crime. Even decades after his death, investigations connected to Carmine Galante's criminal empire continued to produce arrests and convictions. Money he had hidden in offshore accounts was still being discovered and seized by authorities. Associates who had escaped prosecution in the immediate aftermath of his death were tracked down and brought to trial years later, not in 1995, 16 years. After his assassination, federal agents arrested 12 defendants in connection with a money laundering scheme that traced back to investments Carmine had made in the 1970s. The case revealed that his financial network had been even more extensive than previously understood, with holdings in real estate, legitimate businesses, and financial instruments scattered across multiple countries. The investigation also uncovered evidence of murders that had never been solved. Cold case files were reopened as new witnesses came forward, some motivated by guilt, others by the desire for revenge against former associates. DNA evidence and modern forensic techniques allowed prosecutors to build cases that would have been impossible during Carmine's lifetime. One of the most significant breakthroughs came in 2003, when a former associate agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for a lighter sentence in an unrelated case. His testimony provided details about killings that had occurred in the old 1960s and 1970s, leading to the conviction of several elderly defendants who thought they had escaped justice forever. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of these later investigations was what they showed about the scope of corruption that had protected Carmine's operations. Retired police officers, former judges, and ex-federal agents were implicated in schemes that had allowed his organization to operate with virtual impunity for decades. The web of corruption extended far beyond what anyone had imagined during his lifetime. Despite the enormous amount of attention paid to Carmine Galante's life and death, many of the conditions that had enabled his rise continued to exist long after his assassination. Poverty, lack of opportunity, and social exclusion in urban neighborhoods continued to create recruitment pools for criminal organizations. The demand for illegal drugs remained strong, ensuring that new suppliers would emerge to fill any vacuum left by successful prosecutions. More troubling was the persistence of the corruption that had been essential to his success. While individual corrupt officials were occasionally prosecuted, the systemic problems that had allowed widespread corruption to flourish were never adequately addressed. Police departments, customs agencies, and political organizations continued to be vulnerable to the same techniques that Carmine had used to build his protective network. The international nature of modern Crime also made law enforcement responses more complicated and less effective. While Carmine had operated primarily within the United States with international connections, modern criminal organizations were truly global from the start. They could move operations from country to country to avoid law enforcement pressure, making sustained investigations much more difficult. Perhaps most significantly, the enormous profits available from drug trafficking continued to attract new generations of criminals, willing to use violence to build and protect their operations. While the methods became more sophisticated and the organizations more complex, the fundamental dynamic that had driven Carmine's career, the use of violence to control profitable illegal markets, remained unchanged. When all the investigations were complete, all the trials had ended, and all the appeals had been exhausted, the full scope of Carmine Galante's impact on American society became clear. He had been responsible, directly or indirectly, for thousands of deaths, billions of dollars in illegal profits, and the corruption of countless officials and institutions. But he had also, without meaning to, contributed to significant improvements in law enforcement capabilities. The techniques developed to investigate his organization became standard procedures for combating organized crime. The international cooperation required to dismantle his networks led to treaties and agreements that enhanced global law. Enforcement got the legal precedents established in prosecuting his associates strengthened the tools available for future cases. Neighborhoods where he had operated slowly began to recover. After his death and the destruction of his organization, community groups, working with reformed law enforcement agencies, began rebuilding the social institutions that had been undermined by decades of criminal control. Schools reopened, businesses returned, and families began to feel safe, walking the streets again. Yet the recovery was incomplete and fragile. New criminal organizations emerged to fill the vacuum left by the dismantling of Carmine's empire. Different drugs replaced heroin as the substances of choice, but the underlying problems of addiction and violence persisted. A cycle of crime, prosecution, and replacement continued, suggesting that individual criminals, like Carmine, were symptoms of larger social problems rather than their root causes. But in the end, perhaps the most important lesson of Carmine Galante's life and death was that criminal empires, no matter how sophisticated or profitable, ultimately contain the seeds of their own destruction. The violence that builds them eventually turns against them. The corruption that protects them eventually exposes them. The profits that motivate them eventually attract the attention that destroys them. The cigar-smoking boss had achieved everything he had dreamed of as a hungry child in East Harlem. Wealth, power, respect, and fear. But he had also ensured that none of it would last, that his empire would crumble as inevitably as he would die in pursuing his twisted version of the American dream. He had created a nightmare that consumed not only himself but countless others who had the misfortune to cross his path. Smoke from his final cigar had long since dissipated, but the memory of what that smoke represented, a toxic combination of ambition, violence, and moral corruption that had defined his life, would serve as a warning for generations to come. Some victories, his story reminded us, come at too high a price, and some dreams are better left unrealized. The monster was dead, but the conditions that had created him lived on, waiting to produce the next generation of predators who would believe they could succeed where he had ultimately failed. The cycle would continue, as it always had and always would, until society found the wisdom and courage to address the underlying causes rather than simply prosecuting their symptoms. Until then, the legend of Carmine the Cigar Galante would remain a dark chapter in the ongoing story of American crime, a reminder of how far some people will go in pursuit of power and how inevitably such pursuits end in violence and destruction for everyone involved, Dots. Here's what I want you to do. Before you move on, take a second to subscribe to Sleepy Gangster Stories. Hit that bell so you don't miss what comes next. Because trust me, the stories that lie ahead are even darker, even stranger, even more captivating than Carmine Galante's. You'll hear about mobsters who played both sides of the law, politicians who bowed to the mafia's influence, and betrayals so shocking they reshaped entire families. Asterisk. So as we close the book on Carmine Galante tonight, remember this: power is temporary, arrogance is deadly, and no man, no matter how feared, is truly untouchable. This has been Sleepy Gangster Stories. Thank you for spending this time with me in the shadows of history. Stay close, because the underworld never sleeps, and neither do the stories it left behind.